years ago, and now I'm attempting to condense what I've learned into no more than an hour. So there's lots here, and I would like there to be some points during and after for question and answer or comments and stuff if you'd like. So let me know if we need a break. Yeah, welcome to those who are here. We've got people from Parkdale Church, fellow pastors in town, people that I've interviewed. I'm just, yeah, so glad you guys made it out. Also, hello to those online. We've got friends and family. I see people in Vancouver, elsewhere in BC, United States, even Pakistan. So this is pretty exciting. Good morning, Neymar. Yeah, so everyone hear me okay online? Good. I will now pass it over to the faculty at Axe Seminaries to give us a little intro. Maybe if you want to throw them on the screen, Sean, that would be great.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jeff Kuhn. On behalf of Axe Seminaries, I'd like to welcome you all to Tim's presentation. We're really excited about what the evening holds. Just so you're a little bit aware of this process, Tim said he's been at it for 7 years. There's about 3 years of course content that you have to engage as a part of this doctorate ministry program, and then you have to design a research project aiming at something you want to study, something you want to interact with. You have to get that approved. Then you have to do the research. You have to write it up into a very credible form. It's read by a couple of professors who give feedback, and Tim has done all that and done exceedingly well. I'm really excited to hear what he has to present tonight. And so the whole purpose of tonight is he's gonna share his findings with you, and there'll be an opportunity for questions. And then this really, as he said, it's the last step of the process. So tomorrow you'll see him, and it'll be like a glow around his head because the weight is off his shoulders because it's finished. But I don't want to take any more time, but I do want to open in prayer, and then we'll just turn it over to Tim and let him share his findings. So let's pray together. God, we thank you for Tim. We thank you for the work that he's done, for the time that he's invested, for the desire that you put in his heart many years ago to explore how people come to know you. How does the gospel reach the human heart? And we thank you for the work he's done, for the people that he's interviewed. We thank you for what his research has contributed back to the church and to those of us who are trying to walk with others to come to know you. And we just pray that in this evening, he will have clarity of mind and be able to share with us what he's found, and also that it will inspire in us a greater hunger to share the gospel and see your kingdom expand. So we commit the evening to you in Jesus' name. Amen. Take it away, Tim.
Thank you. Sean, if you can activate my PowerPoint, please. There we go. Yeah, and I just want to say that whatever happens here, the good news is that 20 people came to a newfound faith not so long ago, and we can celebrate that. Whatever I have to say, that's good news. And I hope to change the PowerPoint slide soon. There we go. Oh, that's the project. Yeah, so first, I just want to thank the Axe faculty as well. Howard for his help with me in designing the original research and the ongoing encouragement, and Jeff with for helping me put the project together in its final form, and for Kevin for overseeing the program. So thank you guys. Also, just thanks to my wife Emily for her patience through this time. She's looking forward to getting a husband with more headspace soon. Also, thanks for the title, Emily, helping me come up with something relevant for us here. She also told me to not share too many stats, so you can thank her for that. So I always like to start off with questions, and with this title, I'd like to just ask, have you noticed people leaving the church or leaving the faith? Just does that resonate with you, or do you feel like, no, not at all, things are great? Is that a trend that you encounter? Yeah. The Duns, yeah, that is one of, yeah, I've heard that. People have analyzed this because it's a thing, right? It's a trend. Here's some stats. Actually, according to the 2019 census data of in Canada, 32% of Canadians identified as non-religious, and that number jumps up to 40% in BC, 51% in Victoria, and 53% in my generation and younger in BC. So Daryl Gooder, way back in 1998, said it's now a truism to refer to North America as a mission field. That was a while ago he said that. So this isn't a new thing. And many people have reflected on it since then. I think you've made reference to the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada's study, Hemorrhaging Faith, where they were classifying people in their different responses to Christianity, people leaving, people staying. And you can go back further. We've got C.S. Lewis. I love The Great Divorce. It just so vividly describes and portrays the reasons why people say no to God and choose their own way. Pilgrim's Progress, even further back, right? You've got Pilgrim on the narrow path, and there's all the other people that go other ways. So this is just, yeah, I think this has been around a while. One author who talked about it was Skye Jethani, who wrote a book called With, Reimagining the Way You Relate to God. And he was sort of arguing that a lot of the college kids that were leaving the faith that he saw probably never fully grasped the gospel in the first place, and they were leaving something that wasn't an authentic faith. So anyways, looking at these trends, I think it's worth asking if we're even measuring properly in the first place. You know, census data measures affiliation, but is that really our goal at the end of the day? Do we define a Christian by what box they tick on a survey? And if it's that easy, then is losing that really much of a loss at all? When it comes to measuring conversion, years ago, I went through a church planter assessment. I've shared about this with some people, where the assessor asked me, how many people have you led to the Lord? And I asked him to clarify what he meant by that. And he said, well, how many people have you prayed the prayer with? And, you know, for me, I struggled with that because I'd seen a lot of my friends come to faith and I'd heard their testimonies, and sometimes they had an experience of praying a certain prayer and they would do it multiple times without any lasting effect, and only come to a genuine faith at a later date. And, you know, I would see it happen in so many different ways. And for me, sometimes I felt like I had a hand in their coming to faith, but it was a small part and it was God's work. I've also seen other situations where people really want to quantify conversions. So we ask people for outward indications of faith, right? Like coming forward, raising a hand. That can be good, but I really think we have to be careful to not overestimate the importance of those moments and to carefully consider, well, what really is conversion? Gordon Smith, in his book, Beginning Well, it's over there, really good, recommend it. He says the practice of evangelism is undermined by an inconsistent or flawed notion of conversion. And then he goes on to define conversion as the human response to God's saving work for us in Christ. So I'll admit, you know, conversion's a mysterious process that I can't control and don't fully understand, can't explain fully. But I found over the years that as people come to faith, I've heard testimony after testimony, you know, when people are baptized, when people become a church member, we hear their testimony at church. That's been a tradition that I've really enjoyed. And over the years, I've just seen more and more diversity of ways that people come to faith and a diversity of ways that the gospel connects with people's lives. So that's my topic that I'm interested in. And you could say, it started as a bit of an itch to scratch, you know, that I had questions that I wanted to explore more. Like, why do people's testimonies sound so different than common evangelistic formulas that we use or hear? Our evangelistic efforts in line with what is actually working today in people's lives? The topics of the gospel and conversion may sound pretty basic because, you know, they should be. But I don't think it's wise for us to assume that they're totally clear for us all of the time. How are people actually coming to faith? And why is the gospel good news for them? With all the focus on the people who are leaving, why not have a study of the people who are coming in and see what we can learn from them? So that's sort of what I've been doing here with this project. And it's involved a broad review of the literature out there, but also a deep dive into this local context, what's happening here. So we're going to go into that, starting with the Bible, good place to start. And I would just start off by saying that I've noticed a surprising amount of variety in the Bible about how the gospel is expressed. Can anyone tell me, where is the gospel in the Bible? Oh, okay, the whole Bible. Good answer. Yeah. The New Testament. Yeah. Everywhere. John 3:16. Yeah. Very good. Yeah. The word gospel isn't all that frequent. One place I notice it is right at the beginning of the Gospels, where Jesus says what his gospel is. He says in Mark chapter 1, the time is fulfilled, the kingdom of God is at hand, repent and believe the gospel. So what's the gospel there? Yeah, the kingdom is at hand, right? That's the good news that he's calling them to believe, which implies a lot. The people there would understand this is God's reign on earth and he's launching it. And the four gospel accounts, they explain how the life and death and resurrection of Jesus accomplished that. Well, what about Paul? Here's one that we don't see too often. I'm going to say not the one up there, but 2 Timothy 2:8, Paul says, remember Jesus Christ, raised from the dead, descended from David. This is my gospel. And that was it in one sentence. He elaborates on it a little bit more in 1 Corinthians 15, and it ends up being the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus, and what it accomplishes, how it brings us. Well, in all of his letters, he teases out like the implications of that, right? The gospel is the story of Jesus, but in different letters, Paul emphasizes the salvation that it brings, or the fulfillment of God's promises, reconciliation with God and one another, or sanctification in different letters. How about in the book of Acts? Look at the way they preach. Well, when Peter or Paul are preaching to Jews, they're talking about Jesus as the long-awaited Messiah. When they speak to Greeks and pagans, they talk about the true and living God who's going to one day judge at the resurrection. There's different applications and implications of the.
Hello?
Can we pause the people online? Thanks. Tim Keller says in his book, The Center Church, which is here, because the gospel is endlessly rich, it can handle the burden of being the one main thing of a church. So to build on that a bit, it's worth exploring the theology about this when I can change my slide. He's going back and forth a bit. What are the implications of the gospel? What is accomplished by it? And I find there's three main emphases. We've already talked about the death and the resurrection and the life of Jesus. And I think different people emphasize different ones. So for the death, people go to Romans 1-4. There's the bad news of our sin. There's the good news of justification. But that emphasis can end up a little bit narrow, a little bit formulaic, a little bit transactional, right? We're saying something, we're getting something from God. Okay, we're good now. And it can be oriented toward the past rather than a present relationship with God, which someone like J.I. Packer would point out that, hey, justification is important so that we can be adopted into a relationship with God. There's also a future orientation of the gospel, the resurrection, of course, which I've mentioned, 1 Corinthians 15, where we can anticipate a resurrection into a new creation and participate in God's kingdom. N.T. Wright is a really prominent voice in this stream, pointing away from the social gospel of on the left or escapism on the right, and calling people to participate now in God's kingdom work in this world. And then looking to Jesus' life, there's other implications of the gospel. People like Dallas Willard like to point out that, they view God's kingdom on a more individual level as a call to personal transformation. He actually says the really good news for humanity is that Jesus is now taking students in the master class of life. So much more of a personal focus there. Many people have followed his example and have helped people apply the gospel more to their everyday lives. As long as we remember, as Tim Keller says, the gospel is good news, not just good advice. So finally, one more thing to add to that, and that is looking at atonement theory or metaphors, the different roles and metaphors that are used to describe who Jesus is and what he does for us, like the prophet revealing the truth through his life, a priest sacrificing for our sins with his death, and the resurrected king reigning victorious. So again, just to kind of show the breadth of the gospel, because this applies to people's lives in different ways. So knowing that richness of the gospel, we can move on to missiology, which might be my favorite, talking about how to transmit, how to share, how to apply the gospel in different times and places. So I love this topic, and I'll try to be quick. But as already stated, we've seen different gospel applications presented in different biblical contexts in the New Testament. Michael Green adds that as the apostles would go into different places, they'd even change the terms they use, talking about Jesus as the Son of Man or talking about him as the divine Logos, depending on whether they're talking to Greeks or Jews. So that's contextualization. Another author you may have heard of, Frederick Buechner, he put the gospel in literary terms. Does anyone remember how he did that? Talking about the gospel as tragedy with regards to our sin, comedy relating to grace and fairy tale ending. Or John and Charles Wesley, they worked really hard to relate their gospel message to against the backdrop of the gallows and death row in 18th century England. So they spoke about guilt and justification, and it came out of that context. At the same time, you can't go too far. We can't totally accommodate culture and kind of abandon the main message of the gospel. A guy like Francis Schaeffer would point out that we still need to identify where the tension point is in a person's worldview so that we can challenge it. And Tim Keller asserted that the gospel will always be scandalous in every culture. As much as we try to accommodate and speak in their terms, it'll always still be a critique of something in the culture. Finally, Leslie Newbegin. He's a really neat example of a guy who was a missionary in India, and he came home after a long time to his home country of England and found that the culture had changed. And so he sought to apply his missionary mindset to this new situation he found himself in. And he called the church to embody the message and make it plausible. So I actually thought my literature review was done at that point. But then I was told that I need to look at some social sciences to not only focus on what we say as Christians in sharing our faith, but what are people hearing and how are they receiving it and what is it like on their side of things. And so looking at sociologists, they look at the big picture of the context of conversion, the external factors that lead people to make that choice. And one that I'd really highlight is Rodney Stark. Probably some of you have read The Rise of Christianity, The Triumph of Christianity, where he sheds light on how Christianity spread through the Roman Empire through social action and social networks. And here's what he says. Conversion is primarily about bringing one's religious behavior into alignment with that of one's friends and relatives, not about encountering attractive doctrines. Preachers, how do you like the sound of that? That might even be strange to the ears of those who've just read the New Testament, where you see preaching and you see conversion happen. And so, yeah, Jewish synagogues were social networks of that day, but they were also places of preaching scripture. I'm not sure why that needs to be ignored. And Stark talks about how, he's looking at the big picture data, but not really considering individual stories and autobiographies. Others similarly have done studies about the spread of Christianity through conquest in Europe, or the nominalism of Christianity today. And they argue that conversion is mostly about gaining some kind of social benefit, which maybe we laugh at here and now today. Like, is there really a social benefit? Maybe some. But again, they seem to be defining conversion as affiliation and not looking at the internal stuff going on. Michael Green points out that 80% of evangelism in the early church was done through ordinary people. Notice the key word through. Again, this is we're talking about the messenger, but that would imply there's a message. So Gordon Smith struggles with this question about, is the social context the cause of conversion or the context of conversion? And he says that the church is like a midwife for people's new birth, or he compares it to the mediator of the language of faith. And so to some extent, we do have to put some faith in the messenger, right? That we're trusting that, but at the same time, there's a message. And yeah, the church can be the context of conversion, but there still is some content that people are believing. So yeah, moving on from them, other people have done studies that are not just a big picture surface level, but longitudinal, where they're watching people and their change over time. And that can be really helpful as they see people's values and beliefs and behaviors and social connections changing. So a question for you, disciples, when did they become a true believer? When was their conversion? Anyone? How would you describe it? Was there a moment? I mean, there was a moment when Peter believed, it said, but he had been called to ministry before that. He had followed Jesus before that, received the Spirit later. And you can say, well, maybe, that's not us. We're not in that situation, but it's just an example of how there can be stages along the way. And yeah, there's a beginning at some point there, but there's also a process happening. And so a lot of people point to that. One sociologist followed some island tribes that were transferring to Christianity and tried to map out this process, like a point of decision, the time when they incorporated the process of connecting to people and learning new things. Probably the most famous guy about this is Rambo, his name is, where he tried to identify 7 stages that people go through in conversion. These are the common things. And it seems a little bit formulaic, maybe a little bit focused, but it shows that there's a little bit more at play than just ticking a box on a census. So the psychologists, they would talk about internal factors involved in conversion. Smith talks about it as the conversion as the means by which our guilt can be resolved, peace can be found, human longings can be fulfilled. So these are more internal things, right? One person observing the role of emotions and beliefs in conversion. Here's a nice definition. Called it a multifaceted and dynamic process of cognitive transition mediated by structural and contextual forces. I had to put that in there because it's showing, like, there's the word process, cognitive, like it's not just something external, right? Fowler's a guy that some people have maybe read, talking about how the process of conversion can also mirror or parallel stages of development in a person's life, and how youth can sometimes make multiple faith commitments at different points in their journey. So that's all, just interesting. And I guess maybe I'm making it less clear than more clear by sharing all of this, but I think that's kind of the point. So we turn to history next, and this is my favorite, and this is where we're landing, I think, because this is where people actually take people's word for it. You listen to people's stories, you see what actually happened, or at least our best, estimate at what really happened. And so on one hand, a historian like Rodney Stark will look at the conversion of the Vikings and say it was simply a matter of their social ties to one group outweighing their social ties to another group. It's kind of this pragmatic thing. But on the other hand, Michael Green points out, hey, what about the martyrs? There were a lot of people who, there was a high social cost to becoming a believer, many times like that as well. We can't simply simplify it as, social benefits. So, likewise, I've mentioned John and Charles Wesley, where, this guy, Bruce Hindmarsh, actually read their journals to look at what they were thinking as they were crafting messages to people on death row. Again, those people didn't have a whole lot of social benefit to become a believer right before being executed. I think my favorite historian I've found on this, his book is Alan Kreider's collection of written accounts from the early church fathers, their letters, their teachings, their stories.
Whoa, was this on her? That's a very full people.
It's obvious from all of those historical counts that their reasons for coming to faith were various. Some people, they talked about attractive teaching. Some people talked about the admirable character of the believers and personal experiences of healing and deliverance. And in their catechisms and teachings, they brought people through this process of changing their behavior, learning new beliefs, and coming to belong. And so I think we've seen pretty clearly that this process of conversion has several factors, internal and external. There's context and there's content. There's messenger, there's a message. Okay. So I think just landing on this, that the best approach to this kind of topic is narrative. Just listening to people's stories. William James is a historical example of that. I'd also say, have you read any biographies lately? Or do you listen to testimonies in your churches? Because it's a wonderful way to explore this topic. And I hope we can do both of those more. One more definition of conversion is rewriting one's life story in a religious light, assigning new meaning to that story and embodying the story in one's practices, character, and community. So there, it reminds me of what we're doing in Freedom Session, actually, where they talk about rewriting your story with a God-inspired ending. So that's the background. Are there any questions so far? I'm just going to pause before I jump into my own field research. Anything? A lot of things, yeah. There's also the background, right? So there's the before and the after. So yeah, I guess the big question here is like, what's leading up to conversion and what's resulting from conversion? I'm going to map that out a little bit more later. But yeah, like it's true. A lot of people's story is sanctification. Yeah, good point. Yeah. And the work that's before that as well, right? Yeah. But I guess the hard part is, as true as that is, we may not always be able to identify that perfectly in a person's life. And I certainly can't be a judge, right? None of us can, of exactly like, is somebody saved or not, right? So that's the hard part when you're trying to study it. Anyone else? All right, well, so what we're trying to do here is create a local theology, you could say. Missiologist Andrew Wall says that all theology is contextual. And the point being there that, just like the letters we read in scripture, even the timeless creeds of Christianity, they all had a context. They were all answering specific questions in a specific situation. And so in this project, we're seeking to construct a local theology. I was trying to put my ear to the ground and hear, well, what's going on here and now in this time and place? How are people coming to faith? And why is the gospel good news for them? And as that long title indicates, I've had to really narrow it down and focus it. First, in looking for new converts, again, I can't be the judge, right? How am I going to pick people and know if they qualify or not? So baptism was the perfect time-tested way to let people self-identify. And of course, that's knowing that, hey, maybe someone got baptized without truly believing, or maybe someone truly believes and they're not baptized, but I can't be the judge of that. So I found people who had been recently baptized over a 5-year span to keep it focused. Things change quickly, so we're trying to be current here. And also selecting people from evangelical churches in the Victoria area. So letting churches define themselves that way rather than having to subject them to criteria. So this gave me a big enough pool to draw from, but also making it specific enough, hopefully, to say something interesting. So again, what began as a bit of an itch to scratch, a topic of interest that I wanted to explore further with some hunches that needed checking, it finally led to some field research. And I wanted to do a big survey. I had lots of questions for people, but I learned that my questions would probably limit people's answers. And so I needed to do interviews to just let people speak for themselves and say things in their own words without being led or guided by my questions. And of course, this isn't perfect because it does depend on people's words and how good their memory is or how unbiased their accounts are. But hey, that's up to them. And at least I'm not being biased by listening to them. This is also a pretty small and local study, so I can't generalize about the world from this study, but it can be, hopefully it'll raise some good questions that people can follow up with and repeat elsewhere and carry on this journey. So the interviews happened over 2 years ago. It's taken me a while to process them. Some were on Zoom, most were in person, and I'm really thankful again to some of you here who shared your story with me. And I went through 3 sections in the interview, and that was listening to people's background story, sometimes very short and succinct, sometimes very long, whatever people wanted to share. We also talked about the time surrounding their conversion and baptism, and then we also had some time where people described their stories after coming to faith. In all, there were 20 people from 8 different churches, and here's a little graph of where they came from. It was a nice mix of local churches, and 12 of them were from 5 established churches and 8 from church plants. 5 were from larger churches, 15 from smaller. And here's an interesting fact. 14 of them had some previous connection to this building. 2 church plants were meeting in this place at the time of my interview. So there was kind of a nice pool to draw from there. We were also doing Freedom Session that had people coming, and people were attending occasionally, but only 3 of these 20 currently attend here. Okay, so it's not a study just of Parkdale, but more of the network that was available to me. And that's the nature of this. If you're going to get people to do interviews, there's got to be some kind of connection. So that's, you know, the strength and weakness, you could say, of it. Overall, there were 30 hours of audio, which got converted into 190,000 words of transcript that I got to read over about a year. So there's 2 kinds of data with this. One is qualitative, where I'm taking notes and trying to find what's important. And then there's quantitative, where you can use computer programs to come up with keywords and stuff like that. And so I tried to do both and used a coding program to label different parts of people's texts, which is a lot easier than how I used to use a highlighter back in the university days. So I'm thankful for that. Took some demographic data, 12 categories, and we're going to look at that first here. So who has been coming to faith lately in Victoria? The question of who. First, beginning with place of birth. 20% of the people were from Victoria. Does that surprise you? Yes or no? In my church, like that's pretty reflective of I think, my church, that most people are from elsewhere. 35% from elsewhere in Canada. Does that surprise you? Feels like that in Parkdale as well, but maybe it depends where you are. It's actually higher than the average. In 2021, 29% of Victoria had come from elsewhere in Canada. So it's higher than that, but it's a growing trend. It was 15% just not long before that. So this is something to expect, I think, and to be ready to welcome newcomers. 45% were born in other countries. Now, this is unusually high for Victoria. Any guesses what the percentage is for Victoria? People born from other countries? 19. So I think that's significant. Also, most of them from other countries were women in smaller churches and on the younger side. 45% of the people were part of ethnic visible minorities. Now, I don't really like that term much because coming from Vancouver, there's no majority. So it feels weird to talk about that. But again, this is significant because it's much higher than the national, provincial, and city averages. Victoria only has 17% of its population that belong to a visible minority, yet 45% of these new believers are. Similarly, only 19% of Canadian Christians belong to an ethnic minority, according to our census data. Most of them are African, Latino, and Filipino. None of them in my study belong to those groups. So that's significant. And you might say, well, maybe those groups are already Christian when they come to Canada, or maybe a lot of them become Christian as kids, right? And so the people coming to faith are much more diverse than the population we have. even among Christians. For decade of birth, look at this. Notice that big bulge in the middle. That's the middle age bulge. There were 7 born within 1 year of me. And that might sound biased, but hey, I didn't actually know all of them before. And there's something here about a midlife crisis that I think we could explore a little bit later. Also, where are the young people there? It's kind of strange. And maybe local young people are baptized as youth. This study excluded youth, right? It was only adults, right? So it's showing that maybe after people come to faith as youth, there's a bit of a gap, and then midlife, there's another opportunity there. Previous religion, what a spread. 10 people had a nominal Christian background, most of them Protestant, but they were Catholic and Orthodox, and a good, an even balance between immigrants and Canadians with a Christian background, interestingly. So people are coming here already with a Christian background. For the 10 that didn't have any Christian background, half were immigrants and half were Canadian, belonging to certain cults or New Age and things like that. So I think so far we can talk about diversity, right? These people come from different churches, born in different decades, and are more multicultural and more mobile than Victoria's average by far. Also, I don't know if it's surprising or not, but men and women were equally represented. Is that surprising? Maybe, depends where you are. With marriage, there was an even mix, no majority, when it came to people who were married, people who were divorced or never married. Similarly with vocation, there were people who were working, who were on disability, who were retired, who were students. There was no majority, just a complete mix. And so it turns out you could say there's these, I noticed 3 main clusters so far. One is there were 5 people who were married, employed immigrants with no Protestant background at all. There were 5 Canadians who had been divorced and had a nominal religious background. There were 5 Canadians who were on disability and never married. So like, what do we say so far about this? Well, you can see a common thread maybe is that there were some really major challenges in people's journeys. There were obstacles, there were setbacks, whether that's immigration, which can, that's a big thing to overcome, or divorce or disability that may have delayed people in coming to faith until a later date, but also could have provided some motivation in a person seeking. So on that note, looking at trauma, here's a big one. We see that a majority of people had experienced some form of trauma or abuse. 8 of them were men, 10 of them out of the 11 were Canadian. Similarly, a majority struggled with addiction. Again, 8 out of the 11 were men, 10 out of the 11 were Canadian. So maybe just to summarize that question of who so far, we've got 2 types of people here. We can really boil it down to that. There were 10 Canadians who had experienced some form of trauma and addiction. They tended to be older, male, less employed, and mostly unmarried. And there were 7 immigrants who had experienced neither, at least from what I heard in the interviews. They tended to be younger, female, employed, and married. And yeah, there were 3 exceptions to that, only 3. And there were some unique cases there of immigrants who had unique hardships that didn't fit the categories, and a Canadian who was just silent on these issues. But combining all of these challenges, immigration, trauma, addiction, 95% of these people referred to at least one of those. And so that ties in nicely with moving into their background stories. There's a lot in their background stories. I'm going to spend a little more time on this than the later sections. But this section of the interview, I just let it flow and just wanted to hear people's stories. And it provided the context for the person's conversion. What kind of situations were they in? What kind of motivations might they have had in approaching Christianity? There were a lot of references to this, but from all their references, 4 themes really emerged. One was dislocation. Remember, 16 of the people out of the 20 moved here. Moving is a big thing. And it led to major turning points and experience of hardship. Some people were homeless. Some people had trouble adjusting. 19 people mentioned various pressures and challenges, with a majority of them talking about family problems, romantic relationship problems, health and wellness, social problems, vocational problems. A majority mentioned all of those. 18 made over 200 references to their internal negative attitudes and emotions they had, strife with others, feeling opposed to God and feeling opposed to Christianity. And 13 mentioned the negative behaviors that resulted from that, like getting into crime and addiction and just feeling generally lost. So that's sort of the, despite their dismal beginnings and where they came from, they also talked a lot about their response and their journey forward from that, the progress, the pursuits that they made. 17 people talked about felt needs where they were looking for answers. People talked about the need for love, for belonging, healing from their past, or freedom from addiction, of course, and reformation of their character, or just seeking guidance for the future. People also had a lot of questions, and it's hard not to talk too much about it, but people were sorting through the differences between religions and different cults. They had questions about God, Jesus, and the Bible. People were trying to develop a coherent worldview and were seeking evidence for belief. So we can see there's some real practical sides to their story and their journey. There's also some intellectual sides. A lot of people, actually 10 people before coming to faith, talked about reading the Bible and searching for answers in there. 10 people also looked at other religions as part of their journey. And 4 people said they did this completely without church at all. And they had to separate the message of Christianity from Christians because they had problems with Christians. And so for some people, the social side was a barrier in the way. So we've seen a practical, we've seen an intellectual side, but yeah, there was a strong social side as well. Everybody mentioned various encounters they had with Christians, with churches, with God directly. A lot of people had childhood experiences in the church. In fact, all Canadians had some kind of church experience at some point, and half of the foreigners did. Though the majority of those early experiences were negative. Fortunately, in contrast, later in life, most people also had more experiences with church, and they were more positive than negative, slightly more. There were still some negative. And usually it was the same topics brought up about their interaction with the pastor, or the preaching, or the friendliness, or the worship, or the practical help that they were looking for that was offered, which is interesting. I didn't really hear a lot of unique stuff there. Like people were just looking for the basics and looking for it to be done well. People also talked about spiritual encounters, having visions of God and prayers answered and miracles. And that was a really big part of their journey. And this is even before coming to faith. They're having these experiences. And so I share all of that in detail just to kind of show the diversity of people's background experience and to try to boil it down into these 3 aspects here that I have up here, maybe summarizing it with social, conceptual, and experiential. That, some people, their experience and their background, their motivations maybe for coming to faith, there were social problems in their life, broken relationships, and they were looking for a place of belonging and love. But for others, it was very conceptual. They had questions that needed answering before they would come to faith, and they were looking for truth, and they were doing their own research before coming to church. Some people was very experiential, like it was all about their struggle with addiction or the trauma they'd been through, how unhealthy they were. And they had experiences of God as well, and other spiritual experiences, and they're trying to sort it all out. So these categories aren't perfect, but I think they do reflect the academic disciplines we covered as well. Remember sociology, psychology, and history. So maybe. But moving on, we came to the part of the story where people actually start sharing about when they came to faith and what surrounded that. And there's really just 2 things that stand out. I'm calling it means instead of methods because, hey, God's the one at work and he's using various means. It's not like methods that people are employing to make people come to faith. So 2 big things that stood out. One was turning points. There were 18 people that mentioned over 200 references to turning points. This was a really big thing when people are telling their stories. About half of them were very negative and about half of them were very positive. So some people, their early life challenges came to a head, and they used words like they were broken, they hit the end of the road, they had a dead end, they hit rock bottom, they had a breakup, they were suicidal, or they were intellectually disillusioned. So people come to the end of something. Some people had good life transitions that created opportunities for change, like coming out of an unhealthy relationship or being free of addiction, or having a moment of revelation. Around the time of their conversion, people also talk a lot about influences in their lives, a lot of family and friends, as well as input from church and different groups and gatherings that they had. So you can see in this part of the story too that I've raced through, there are parallels to those three aspects that I mentioned earlier. That's kind of the point here, is that the social and the conceptual and the experiential challenges of their background at their time of conversion were being addressed and being resolved. So after looking at those circumstances surrounding their conversion, a lot of people, they had interesting ways of describing their actual crossover and becoming a Christian, using different terms and pointing to different triggers or clinchers that sealed the deal for them. So, you know, I'd say the most things I saw was actually on the conceptual side, people talking about realizations of truth, like finally coming to believe or understand something about the Bible being true, or God being real, or what Jesus has done for them, or their guilt and need for forgiveness, or God's love. I mean, some people talked about joining community. Some people talked a lot about the feelings they had around their the conversion experience, the relief and energy and warmth and satisfaction and presence of God that they felt. Most people talked about spiritual experiences too, and the practical effects that happened at their conversion, this change in their life, feeling cleansed or being healed or set free from addiction. People talked about it being momentary or a process. 5 people talked about an early conversion experience, and now they're coming back to that again. 11 people were just really ambiguous about when exactly it was. They couldn't put their finger on it. 6 people talked about being an anonymous Christian and then coming out into the open, and that was their conversion. So it's just, yeah, described so differently to different people. As for their baptism, it's the same thing. People had such a variety of ways they described it. For a lot of people, this was coming into community, their act of baptism. And for 8 people, it wasn't their first, which I don't know, that might sound funny, but a lot of people had very early or infant baptisms that just, or in a cult as well, that it wasn't genuine for them. They wanted to do it again. So again, we see here, I think that those 3 aspects are showing up where, yeah, these previous challenges in their background are being resolved at this point here. And so just to try to start putting it together, I've got this little drawing just to take a breath. I found it helpful to express people's stories visually in this way, where on the top, you can see the 3 stages of someone's journey, their background, their conversion, and their Christian life. And the curved line is meant to represent momentum. So if you think about like the uphill part as being overcoming challenges in their background and you know, the effort and the pursuit of heading up that hill, while the peak represents this moment where they're finally at rest and they've got this perspective of their whole journey. And the downhill part, it's not decline, but it would represent the results that are flowing from their conversion, the fruits that come. And so I like to use this to try to encapsulate a story. And I was doing this in my research, is how can I summarize each and every story? And I really wish we could just stop and hear people's stories, because that would be so interesting. So maybe we need another evening just to let people share their stories. It's not my place to do that for others, though. So first, just finishing off the downhill side, what did I hear about people's results of their conversion? You know, honestly, I could say it was a lot of the same kind of categories that we've talked about already. But first, just to say, it wasn't smooth sailing down that hill. There were ongoing challenges in all of the categories. About people were still working through intellectual questions and addictions and relational issues. At the same time, there was a lot more on the positive side. I heard stories of marriages that were saved and people set free from all kinds of things and feeling healed. So it was an ongoing process, but there was a huge change. And again, the things that were identified in their early life had definitely been changed. So just to put this together, these results, they correspond with the three aspects we're talking about. And Gordon Smith says about conversion, no two haiku poems are the same, but you know what a haiku poem is because it has certain elements, right? Same thing with a football game. No two football games are the same, but they all have four quarters and the yard lines, and there's things that make them a football game, right? So similarly here, if we go back to that hilltop analogy, we can ask ourselves, okay, well, we all have these stages of our journey, and there's these aspects of the social side, the conceptual side, the experiential side. Where do those fit into each story? Where do they fit in your story? Do they all fit? People's stories were so unique, and I found that these things happened in different orders. And I mapped it out as I went through the transcripts and listened to people's stories. I tried to take note of which of those aspects were most prominent in different stages of their journey. And as you can see, here it is. I mapped it out, and it wasn't perfect like one each, because some people's stories were very complex and they had multiple things happening at the same time, of course. But as you can see here, the social aspect was really prominent in people's background stories as a motivator, and also the result in their ongoing Christian life. But the conceptual side was the biggest one at that moment of conversion. Experience was something that was steady throughout. So, this also happened there were different aspects happening in different patterns and different orders. So if you can imagine, like, some people had a common thread where it was one aspect throughout, maybe for them, it was a conceptual thing, and they had these theological questions, and then they were answered, and then they kept learning. Or people who had broken relationships, and they came into this loving community, and they continued and grew in that. There were some common threads, but then there were also people that had a progression where one aspect was taken care of, and that led them to enter into this other aspect of their growth and development, and another. So I'd love to look at that in more detail, but you can read my paper if you want. Right. So, I began this whole interview with open-ended questions, like I said, right? Listening to people's stories, letting them share what they want. But eventually I came to some more pointed questions of saying, of checking my conclusions, because I've been trying to summarize what I've seen and heard. But at the end, I wanted to ask people, well, maybe you can summarize it for me, and I'm going to check my conclusions against that. And people made a lot of generic statements about their conversion. It was a process of change. They gained a new direction or perspective. It's a relationship with God. Again, there's all these. I just want to point to the variety here. That's the one point from this slide here. The way people talked about God, his goodness, his greatness, or his presence. I asked people for their favorite Bible verse. Again, a very specific, non-threatening question to try to uncover, like, what's Christianity all about for you? What's the main point, if you could boil it down, if you could summarize it for me? And I was shocked that aside from one person who couldn't answer and two people who just talked about what they heard in the latest sermon, everybody else had a unique answer. And there was no John 3:16, and there was no Romans Road. It was just unique. Every person's favorite story was different. And that goes for all the secondary ones as well. And there was a mixture of, some people talked about their favorite Bible character or story. Some people talked about teaching and principles that they followed. And other people, it was promises and prophecies that they were hanging on to. And I was just like, wow, like, this is more diverse than I could have imagined. And so I gave them a final question. Here it is, the final question, asking people sneakily what the gospel was, by saying, if you could sort of summarize Christianity in a nutshell, if you were to share about your faith with a friend, what would you say? Like, what's it all about? And again, you can see the diversity. Some people, they talk about salvation, first thing that comes to their mind. Other people, it's Jesus, who he is and what he's done. Relationship with God, changed life. And as you know, there's 20 people. So people talked about multiple things. There's crossover. But the interesting thing about that is like, okay, those are not surprising, but the time orientation with which they referred to them. There was, as you can see, with salvation and Jesus and life change, there was a huge focus on what had happened in the past and how it was ongoing in the present. That was a big emphasis. Regarding a relationship with God and finding a better life, there was a huge focus, again, on the present. And so, yeah, while some people talked about heaven and future prophecy, a lot of people talked about how Christ's past work is affecting them today. Present was the big one. So those are my findings. And yeah, got to talk about limitations because, again, I'm not going to generalize about the whole world here. And I don't really like generalizing, and I'm kind of skeptical of those kind of statements because I know there's always exceptions. And I think we've seen today there's such a diversity with people. And as a pastor, I've learned to view people as unique and to value every story. And so it's hard to talk about them generally because I'd rather just have you hear people's real stories. But I hope that these categories can at least help us in ongoing conversations on this topic. So for this study, I only interviewed 20 people. And only baptized people in evangelical churches in Victoria. So that a lot of them had some kind of connection here too, right? So again, there's limits there. And I think this is, we need to look further to learn more about this. As for the trends that I talked about, I do think they're genuine because, for example, those who've immigrated, most of them did not go to an ethnic church. For those who had addiction, most of them did not attend our recovery program here. And for those who were close to my age, most of them went to other churches and were not baptized by me. So I don't think there was a lot of bias in those things. But there are some unanswered questions like, where are the 20-year-olds, right? Maybe there are other churches or other ministries or not in church at all right now, or maybe they were baptized as youth, right? So that's worth looking into. As for the categories I talked about, again, I think they parallel some of the academic disciplines we've looked at, or even just some concepts you may have heard before, like believe, belong, become, right? There's all of these aspects, or body, soul, and spirit. So though those ideas are kind of subjective, right? And we just have to pick words and they're not going to be perfect. There is some objective information I'd like to share with you. I talked about all of the words in the transcript and how the program generated keywords. And then with those keywords, they're able to make this word cloud. And so you can look at that and you can tell me whether my categories are accurate or not, right? See what the computer says on that. I think we can see some social things there, some conceptual things. Experiential is a lot more diverse. You got to look at the gray ones around the edges probably. Happy to share this with people if they'd like. So just to, wrap it up, a couple conclusions here. I just really want to emphasize again the diversity of what I saw. It was surprising. These new believers are more ethnically diverse and more mobile than the general population and the Christian population, and concentrated in certain churches. And despite the variety of gender and age, or gender and marriage and vocation, there was quite a bulge in that middle age category, which I think is notable. Have you guys noticed that at all? Adults coming to faith around that middle age? Anyone? I think maybe it gives us hope, right? That there are, if they miss it as a kid, there's other times. Another thing, that these common aspects we've talked about, people's stories covered similar themes, but they happened in different orders. And I think that's helpful to know, is that, somebody's needs in approaching the faith might be different than what they were for your story. And the effects of their faith might look different as well than in your story as well. And then third, the richness of the gospel. In response to people's various struggles and questions and needs, the good news of Jesus had an answer for all of them in different ways. We saw people's words about Jesus applying to their past, their present, and their future. We saw people's favorite Bible verses connecting to them in different ways through relatable stories or practical teaching or future promises. And we saw people's description of God emphasizing different things as well. Not that one is right and one is wrong, but just that different things impacted people differently. For a couple applications, I would built on that, I'd just say we need to be receiving people well, knowing the diversity of our city and the diversity of people coming to faith. We need to be ready to be flexible and welcoming, and also not to be scared off by people's challenges, because we can see that people's challenges and turning points are actually a really key point in their journey of coming to faith, right? And so things like immigration or abuse or addiction, maybe those are potential turning points where if we can meet them at the point of their need, that can be part of their journey in coming to faith. We can also be careful to avoid becoming social clubs that are united around the wrong things, right? As a church, like to be united by similar age or style or social class or favorite hockey team or whatever it may be. No, we need to unite in essentials only, leaving space for the diversity of the body as it grows without any unnecessary barriers. We also need to be patient with the process. That, if we can, the better we understand conversion, the better we can engage in evangelism in a way that's effective and that meets people where they're at, with their needs, with their questions. So rather than anxiously pushing people to make a decision and then abandoning them, we can again see the whole process, right? That there's a background to that story and there's results to follow. And with a full perspective of the process, we can also be a little bit more humble too about our role to play in people's stories, that there's a lot of different factors at play in each person's story, affecting different aspects of their lives. And we all have a small contribution in that. And last, the value of story. We just need to learn to listen better. If there's one thing that I could learn from this whole doctorate, if I can just be a better listener, if there's one thing we can all go home with, is just a desire to hear people's stories first and to understand their side before we do too much talking. What's going on in the life journey of the listener? So that matters. And that's why I like history so much, because I think they try to do that. So lastly, recommendations, more interviews. I only did 20. I didn't cover enough. It was long enough as it is, but I think this is something that can be repeated. With the themes and the questions that I've explored, they could be applied in other contexts, like a church or another city or a ministry or a denomination or a people group. And secondly, gospel fluency. I wish I had learned more about this earlier, just how broad and deep the gospel can be applied to people's lives. And I hope that we can be encouraged by what we've seen and what we've heard today, to just explore the gospel more. And you can read the Gospel of John and see how Jesus talks to different people differently, and the different metaphors he uses at different times to illustrate who he is and what he does. My favorite book on that topic is The Unbelievable Gospel, right there. We're reading it as a church board, and it really helps explore that topic. There's other resources. I've got some on the table, but that's it for me. And I would love to welcome some questions. First of all, in person, if we could focus here, and then we can, while you guys online maybe prepare some questions too, we can turn you on in a minute. Anything, questions, comments, discussion. This is where I have to defend my thesis, right? Where's my water? Yeah. Am I aware of anyone else who's done similar work? There are the odd compilation of stories in book form. Scott shared a great one with me that I've enjoyed reading by my bedside. A study like this, not that I know of. There are some with the psychologists that I read where there was one where he interviewed a bunch of youth and heard about their multiple faith commitments over time. So there's some that have pointed out like that. So maybe more on the psychological side where people are actually interviewing. The historians obviously can't, and the sociologists deal with data. Yeah, so it's worth looking into more. Yeah. Well, like I said, being a better listener to people. I think being ready to imagine or receive diversity in people's stories, right? That I'm not approaching people with expectations about how their story is going to go, but knowing that, hey, even with those three aspects, you can make 9 combinations in those 3 stages of their journey. So just understanding that people's stories go through different processes. Those are a couple. Yeah. Yeah, okay. So that question was, how do I plan to go forward with this, right? And yeah, with what I've learned. Yeah. So those are a couple. Yeah. Yeah.
What's one or two surprises for you? Moments where you
Yeah.
into that?
Yeah. So as a preacher, oh, sorry. Haha. What were some surprises? Very good question. Thank you. As a preacher, at reading the book of Acts and things like this, reading the Bible, I'm looking at what do I need to say to lead people to come to faith. And looking at that, like, there was definitely a conceptual side, right? It was big. And I think some people ignore that and say, oh, it's only social. And so it's like, yeah, for some people, they have some questions, they have some things to learn. But for some people, it was very just experiential. I knew a guy who was addicted for his whole life. He called out to Jesus for help, and he never drank again after that. It was an experience of Jesus in his life, and he changed. So I think I started this whole project with an idea of looking into theology and Bible and missiology, like I said, and I thought I was done there. And then I was told, look at the other side. So for me, those were where the surprises were, was, yeah, the receiving end and learning about that. Yeah. We can put people online too. I'm going to unmute my computer. But yes.
Were there many people you spoke to who had a event moment sort of thing? Right.
Yeah, thank you for that question. No. The question was, were there many people who went to a big event and had a big experience there? I know people who have, not these people. And that's like I said, I never heard Romans Road. I never heard John 3:16. I never heard about a Bible tract, even like street preaching, or going to a rally or something like that. It was never that. Yeah, like there were moments, but it was like an experience of God, like having a vision or an answered prayer kind of thing. Those were moments. I'm just going to double check my. Okay, now they're on. If anyone wants to speak online, feel free, and in person, yeah, as well. Yeah, Rick. One person talked about that in charismatic Anglican upbringing about 40 years ago or something. There wasn't talk about that. I'll admit, I don't think I interacted with people from Pentecostal churches, for one, locally. That would be a good area to explore more of. Like I put out the word to local churches and pastors and took what I could get, right? But no, I didn't see or hear talk of revival or like these big events. We also don't have a lot of big events like that locally, right? Or lately, especially. This went through some COVID years as well, right? So people were digging in deep to local communities more, and there was less of that. Yeah, in the back. Ooh, yeah. Yeah, there are so many layers to this data. Okay, sure, yeah. Were there any similarities according to age group? I'm not sure I looked at that too much. I can say that with age group, the younger side were more ethnically diverse and more female. Yeah, that's another layer where like I could circle back. Like I had just way too much data to cover and I was cutting. But that's something where I could go back and look and look at people of a certain cluster and compare it. So yeah, great idea. Thank you for the question. That's a really good question. Yeah. Yes.
Tim?
Oh, one online. Okay. Yeah. Jeff.
Yeah, there's a question. Kevin asked, how is social trauma defined in your research?
Great. Thanks for the question. Yeah. Racism was for some, and social ostracism, like bullying at school. That's what, yeah, there was only a few cases, but that's what it was. Yeah. Yeah, it was, yeah. Finding faith. Yeah. Okay. Hmm. Yes. I mean, okay. Was anger mentioned in people's background stories? So yeah, that's where there's all the detail of data that I couldn't share in this presentation, but I mentioned, like, 19 people mentioned emotional and internal problems, right? So anger was a really big one. When people were describing their background, from years ago, and like in a nutshell, here's what my life was like before faith. Anger was frequently mentioned. The alcohol was connected to that. Um, there was, words like despair. Like I have this long list of adjectives people use to describe themselves. I'm just trying to put it in a nutshell. It was hard, but anger was a big one.
Question online, Tim. Sorry, question online.
1 second. So yeah, anger at God. There were people who said they were actively opposed to God and angry at him or at the church. And that's connected partially to the negative experiences of faith that fortunately more were positive later on approaching conversion. Yes, Dave.
Hi. Just an observation first from another social researcher I heard once. He said that this kind of study, using detailed interviews and codifying them down to a point where you can make sense of them. He said, this is research that is not for the faint of heart. So I just wanted you to say I admire what you've achieved here. Now, my question, and maybe this goes to Jeff as well as to Tim. If another graduate student working through the ACT seminaries wanted to piggyback on Tim's work, in other words, to produce a similar set of interviews from a different set of 20 people, is there a mechanism for doing that?
Well, I can't answer that, but the director of the program, Dr. Kevin O'Coin, is on. Kevin, do you want to address that question?
Uh, I don't know if there's a mechanism per se, but having that kind of continuity is a really great idea. And we love that interplay between students. So I think there are a number of projects that we've had that have had similar focus from one to another. So I don't see any reason why someone else couldn't pick up on this and do, yeah, a different location or I don't know, following up with the same people in 10 years or something like who knows? There's lots of different ways. There's lots of different ways to do that. And so every DMIN project ends with a suggestions for further research. And that's exactly why we ask people to include that, because people can then take that and run with it, if that makes sense, Dave.
Yeah. And Dave, to your point about yeah, the difficulty, I think maybe that's subconsciously how I came up with the idea of the hilltop analogy, because it felt like one hill after another for a long time.
Oh, you had the hills, eh?
Yeah. Yeah, others, thoughts,
Tim,
questions.
Tim,
Yeah.
I've got a question.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, like I'm wondering, based on your research, would it be fair to say that if in church settings we listened to conversion stories more often, it would help us become more effective in sharing the gospel?
Yeah, that's where it all began for me. Like I would hear people's ways they would understand, like, this is how you share your faith, or this is how you become a Christian. And then I would hear testimonies, and it's like, oh, that's different, you know, and every single testimony successively, it just kind of added to the diversity. So eventually it's like, let's put this together into something I can share. Um, I think it's a wonderful thing, because there might be people in the church hearing that testimony who say, oh, that's more like me, you know, not like the stereotypes that maybe we've read about, like we're not all Martin Luther or John Wesley or something, right? Yeah. Is there another?
I got a question. Is that all right? No?
Yeah, sure. All the way from California. Welcome.
Right. Yeah. So first of all, we still love Canadians here in the United States. And I'm Tim's father-in-law. So just on behalf of Emily, I want to say thank you for finishing. But also, one of the things that I really appreciated in what you said and what you've done is the way that you enjoyed and affirmed and appreciated these various stories. You know, you didn't come with a certain bent that it had to go this way or had to go that way. You were welcoming and listening, and I just think that's great. So I just want to say thank you for doing that. I've got a couple of questions. One is, I deal with a lot of college students. I'm recently retired from Westmont College, and students sometimes there would talk about deconstructing their faith and then maybe reconstructing their faith.
Mhm.
But I'm curious if that phrase has any resonance. Now, you aren't dealing with 20-year-olds, so I don't know. But there are churches in town that are devoted to those who are in that phase of life.
Yep.
So my second question, I'll let you answer that, and I'll just get off. But my second question, and maybe you've answered this, is there some place along the way where you thought your faith was challenged by some of these stories? Like, whoa, uh, that's something that I could use in my own life, or I might be awakened to.
Thanks. First one, there was one of the 20 that close to my age, and she talked about a later deconstruction, actually, after her baptism, which was recent. So this was all very recent, but she was, as I was interviewing her, she was sort of in this process of kind of intellectual deconstruction of her faith. So she'd come into contact with some other ideas and opinions and was struggling through that, and said, is it still okay? You know, do I still qualify? And I'm like, well, you were baptized in the last 5 years, so I'm not going to reject anybody. But yeah, she kind of felt like an exception. She was going through that. And again, it's not up to me to define where she's at or her heart. But yeah, I encountered that. There were also people, like I said, like 10 people with sort of a nominal Christian background. And so to some extent, they did deconstruct that and come to a new understanding of faith as well. Yeah, as for challenging my faith, at first I thought you meant like me feel, doubting or something, but yeah, to like challenge to grow. Thanks again for the good question. I don't know if there's so many things I've been thinking and focusing on, and that's maybe one I need to look back on more. Definitely just growing in an appreciation for people who aren't like me, and that we're different from each other. I think I'd been seeing that all along, but it was just, yeah, more confirmed. I think a greater appreciation for how God really can change people's lives instantaneously and dramatically, and that God is reaching out to people in more spiritual ways too, right? Like I said, visions and ways that I might not expect or even ask God for, that God is still at work in these surprising ways, and that there's so much happening before people even come into contact with church sometimes. So I think that's just humbling, right? And I think challenging me to maybe hope and ask for more, and to be more open to maybe be watching more closely for what God is doing in people's lives. There were a couple of hands here. Yeah, Robert.
How much you think the media?
Huh.
You mentioned COVID.
Yeah. Mm. Yeah. Great use of the word conduit there, because that's something we talked about, right? There's things that are contexts or conduit. He asked what influence did social media play? Yes. So there were, I don't want to share people's individual stories too much, but you know, some people during COVID, they were online and home and in isolation. And actually that began like a YouTube search, right? Where people start listening to online preachers and encountering new ideas and teachings. So that's part of that deconstruction, where maybe their previous faith or situation, you know, that's been cut off, and they're open and they're exploring. When I mentioned people reading the Bible, that included a lot of online and audio as well. So yeah, like I have numbers. It's in my paper if you want to read it. But definitely, like that was a channel that people were using, and it opened people up to new churches, new preaching, new ideas. Yeah. Sorry, how different is it for me to? Yeah. Sure. Yeah. So people can come. I've heard preachers, pastors say that people come to their church having already been listening to them online, and now they meet in person, right? So yeah, there's some recalibration that happens. You know, people come with all kinds of ideas and beliefs that they've developed through this online community, and now they come into this in-person community, right? So yeah, it's a change, and that would be a neat thing to study, like people who come to faith online and then come into in person. Would be a neat comparison. Yes, Alice. How many were born again? Yeah. Okay. So 5 people mentioned an early conversion experience, like maybe even in their childhood, right? But for various reasons, they didn't get baptized in a Christian community, and they didn't exactly deny that earlier conversion. There were people that had baptisms early that weren't meaningful to them as well, right? And so they came to a, you know, as you said, born again, they came to a true faith, and then they did get baptized again. So there was quite a mixture that way. A couple, to be honest, a few people said like they were maybe baptized as an infant, and they're in the faith and church of their family, but they didn't they came to faith through other churches and other groups, and couldn't leave until their parents passed away. That was part of some people's stories. And so that's one reason for the delay, is like not wanting to dishonor parents. And they made the switch later on. And so there's like this huge delay between a conversion and baptism. Yeah. Others? Yeah. Well, yeah, good question. Did everyone know me before? No. 5 were from Parkdale, as you saw. There were some that were in church plants that met here, who I kind of knew a little bit. there was, I didn't know, definitely not many. So it was more like they knew of me or I knew of them or I knew their pastor and there was that connection that way. So do I think it would have been different? Their answer is different. Yeah, you know, if people are attending my church, members baptized by me, I'd be curious to know. I'd be curious to ask them, like, did they feel more or less open to share? For sure, it's a good question, and I guess I don't know. I don't know, but I'd say most were not known to me before. Yeah. Okay. Well, guys, I know
Hey,
it's yeah. Okay.
yeah, let me just weigh in, Tim. I think you can read the room for what's going on there, and you guys can feel free to stay and talk. But I think been a great presentation. We appreciate what you've had to share and the work that you've done. And I know it probably feels good to come to the end of this 7-year run. And I'm thankful for the work that you've done. You've presented really well. I think it's a benefit for the church. And I kind of get the honor as the guy who brought you home as a project supervisor, being the first person to say, congratulations, Dr. Tim Stewart, on finishing your presentation. Very well done. And I think the online portion, I've asked Kevin, who's, as I said, is the director of the program, if he would pray for you, and we'll wrap up the online portion, and you guys can stay and talk as long as you want. But I'll turn it over to Kevin if that's okay, and he'll pray, and then we can wrap up the online thing.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I'm happy to do that. Tim, it's been a pleasure. We had DMin classes together a number of years ago. We went, you and me and your wife was with us at the time, went to Montreal and had a great time together. So I remember that well, and it's good to see you come to the end of your DMin journey. And I hope this is a launch pad into better and deeper ministry in your context there. So let me pray and then we'll wrap up. Thank you, Lord, for the work that Tim has done, and also for the work that you have done in the lives of the people whom he has interviewed. Thank you that you are still active, that you are changing hearts even in midlife, that there is opportunity always to come into alignment with your purpose and mission. So thank you for your goodness, and thank you for guarding Tim and his family in the midst of this long journey. And we thank you that it's come to an end. So thank you for your faithfulness and goodness, and we pray these things in your name. Amen. All right, Tim, congratulations.
Thanks for joining us online. I'm gonna mute me.
Congrats, Tim.
You guys can keep chatting if you want. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, guys. There is some fruit and drinks and snacks. Feel free to hang around as long as you'd like. Thank you for coming as well. It means a whole lot, church and friends in town here. Yeah, thanks for sharing this with me. Next week.